All right, Mark chapter 4, we're going to pick up where we left off last time in verse 35. That day, when evening had come, he told them, "Let's cross to the other side." So they left the crowd. There we go. They left the crowd and took him away in a boat without making any special preparations. Other boats were with them. Some say they were little boats, if you remember that. Anyways, verse 37, and a violent windstorm came up, and the waves began breaking into the boat, so that the boat was rapidly becoming swamped. What we would call a lake, they called the Sea of Gennesaret. And here's a little map that you can see, and right here is the Sea of Galilee, Sea of Gennesaret. Most of Jesus' ministry, he worked out of the base at Capernaum here in the northeast. Now, these cities were, you can see on this list, there's a whole lot of stuff that Jesus actually did in his Galilean ministry. Where they are at right now is here, and they're going to be going over here to Jairus. Excuse me, I'll try to say it yet. Jairus. So they're crossing across the lake, which is about a mile wide. It's pretty small, and you can see across it pretty easily. But to give you a little more a picture other than a map of what I'm talking about. Oh, well, before I do, right here at Bethsaida, on this side of Bethsaida, there is two large mountains with ravines next to them. They're called the Horns of Hittim. And the winds would come down from the northeast, and they would blow through the northeast, and they would blow through those ravines. And what it would do is it would stir up really fast, dangerous storms on the sea here. This picture, essentially, Bethsaida is going to be here, and so you can kind of see they're going from here to here, which is about a mile trip. It's not very long. It just so happens that they're going in front of those Horns of Hittim as they go across. So it just kind of gives you a reference point in your mind. Verse 38. But Jesus was in the back of the boat, asleep on a cushion, a mat. So they woke him up and they asked him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" Then he got up, he rebuked the wind, and he told the sea, "Calm down, be still." And the wind stopped blowing, and there was a great calm. He asked them, "Why are you such cowards? Don't you have any faith yet?" Overcome with fear, they kept saying to one another, "Who is this man? Even the wind and the sea obey him." Now, they've seen Jesus cast out demons. They've seen Jesus heal whole towns at a time. They had not seen a storm like this before. Now, these were hardened fishermen, and their mainstay was Capernaum. This was their main job. They lived off this water day in and day out. They knew these bad storms, and yet they were still scared for their lives. Now, the New King James says there was also little boats that followed them. Can you imagine the little boats, what they were facing? It doesn't tell their story, but I guarantee you they were holding on for dear life. Jesus, all he has to do is get up, say, "Calm down, be still." The word is muzzle. In other words, Jesus would have said, "Muzzle yourself," to the winds and the waves. Now, why that's important is because Jesus' first miracle in Mark chapter 1, he encounters the man that's demon-possessed, remember? And when the demon starts saying, "I know who you are, you're the Son of God," Jesus says the same exact words. He says, "Be muzzled, be quiet." So the idea here is this was not a natural disaster storm. No, this was something much more severe. Although it had its natural face to it, there was much more spiritual going on. This was no ordinary storm. It was the spiritual war that Jesus was facing. We talked about it in chapter 2, that Jesus, with all that he was going through, he went up to the mountain and prayed by himself. So Jesus here, he's going to the other side of the lake. What's interesting about going to the other side of the lake is that this isn't Jewish territory anymore. This is all Gentile. Decapolis and Gadara and Gesera, these are all areas, are Gentile areas that Jesus is entering. And so what literally is going on, Jesus prays that morning, and God the Father says, all right, when you get done with the day, I want you to go by night, and I want you to go attack enemy territory, because I want you to free captives inside enemy territory. And so that's what Jesus is doing. And so this storm is Jesus breaking through enemy lines, spiritually speaking, going into the Gadarenes. No wonder Satan was trying to stop him so badly. Because Jesus was going to go in and take the captives and make them free. But also that's interesting is this is Gentile. This is pagan. These are polytheistic people. And Jesus is going out to rescue them as well. So they're going across the sea. They get this massive storm. Satan tries to stop them. And chapter 1 now. They arrived at the other side of the sea in the territory of Gerasenes. Just as Jesus stepped out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came out of the tombs and met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any longer, not even with a chain. He often had been restrained with shackles and chains, but had snapped the chains apart and broken the shackles into pieces, and no one could tame him. He kept screaming night and day among the tombs and on the mountainsides, and kept cutting himself with stones. The townsfolk didn't know how to deal with this guy. They'd tried everything they knew to do. They'd tried to separate themselves, kick him out of town. That didn't work. They made him live in the tombs. They made him live in the graveyard with the dead people. They chained him up with chains and shackles, and none of them would hold him. They'd done their best, but what does Jesus do? Jesus just shows up and says, you can be gone. Leave him. He doesn't have to jump up and down and scream, and I'm sure there was a lot of people that were trying to do that to get this man free, and nothing was to avail because their religion had no power. But notice this poor man, where the demons have brought him. He's living among the dead. He's uncontrollable. He's had outbursts of rage, anger, and violence. Now, although this does mention, I should mention this too. The other Gospels, when they mention this, they talk about two people that were filled with demons. Mark just points to the one, because the one is his focus, but there's actually two. But anyways, these boys, they have outbursts of rage, violence. They're alone out there. They're naked. They're cutting themselves. It's an awful place. But you think about it, that's pop culture today, isn't it? That's what everybody celebrates. They celebrate the horror flicks. They celebrate, rage and anger. What we are supposed to be seeing as a poor, pathetic, pitiable man, in the world around us, we see it as normal day culture. That should scare the living daylights out of us. This is a list of people all around us and how they spend their days. We are supposed to look on this man with pity, but we look at our neighbors the same way the town did. Reject them, or we try to control them, or we try to avoid them, instead of trying to have pity on them and help them. But Jesus came intentionally over the water, through the storm, to free these two men. He went out of his way. He put himself in danger to free these two. The God the Father told Jesus, it's time to go into enemy territory and free captives. And boy, I hope that's what we do in our church too. That in our lives, in the circles that we have, those that are trapped, those that are struggling, those that are being defeated by sin, we provide a way of escape. Verse 6. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and he fell down in front of him, screaming in a loud voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you in the name of God never to torment me." Jesus, had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he told him, "My name is Legion, because there are many of us." And he kept pleading with Jesus not to send them out of the region. We see this constantly in the scriptures as we're doing the study. Spiritual forces coming at Jesus. They know that he's the Messiah. The demons know that he's the Messiah. Too bad the people don't. Or if they do, they're rejecting him. The demons are doing their best to stop Jesus' progress, especially in their own territory. Whether it's a supernatural storm or a demon-possessed man or the religious leaders interrupting Jesus' teaching as he's trying to explain things, or they're trying to just simply trap him. All of these spiritual forces are fighting Jesus. You know, you'd think about it. If Jesus is coming, the Son of God, if he's coming into your area and you are a demon and you know your end, which they do, and they'd mentioned it, you'd think you'd run the other way. But that was not their orders. Their orders was to confront Jesus and to stop him what he was doing. But what happens every time spiritual forces come at Jesus, it's always the same. They come to him, they try to stop him, and they end up bowing the knee in submission. And it doesn't matter if it's a legion. By the way, a legion, it was somewhere between 3,600 to 6,000 Roman troops. And there's numbers all over that area, but that'll give you an idea. We know it's at least 2,000 because of this story. But the idea is, it doesn't matter how powerful they are, they come up to Jesus and they have to bow the knee in submission. And once they do that, they're requesting Jesus not to torment them. Ooh, his power. Verse 11. Now a large herd of pigs was grazing on the hillside nearby. So the demons begged him, "Send us among the pigs so that we can go into them." So he let them do this. The unclean spirits came out of the man, and they went into the pigs, and the herd of about 2,000 rushed over the steep slope into the sea and drowned there. Now, I did some math, okay? And this is completely subjective, I'll be honest, but I hope it'll put us a little bit in perspective. So I looked up, I couldn't find the price, what someone would have paid for a pig in that day. But I did find what they would pay for a sacrificial lamb. And a sacrificial lamb in today's finances would have cost you, one lamb would have cost you about $350, okay? Now, pigs were somewhat similar to sheep because in the Gentile world, they were used for sacrifices, they were used for food, celebrations. They were much like the Jews cover sheep. So, if we just compare them, and again, this is very subjective, and even a normal number, you know, some pigs are fatter, some pigs are skinnier, you know, the number would fluctuate. But just as a ballpark of roughly about the same price, if one pig would have cost about $350, whoever owned these pigs lost $700,000 that day in a matter of moments. Now, even if you took a third of that price off, and this guy, his herd wasn't worth that much, he still lost 6 figures. He wasn't a happy camper. His livelihood was completely destroyed. Now, like I said, I know that's completely subjective, but at least it gives you an idea in your mind of how much this man lost. Verse 14, now when those who had been taking care of the pigs ran away, they reported what had happened in the city and the countryside. They went screaming. So the people went to see what had happened. And when they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had been possessed by the legion of demons sitting there, dressed in his right mind, and they were frightened. Now think about this. Mark makes sure to mention that they were frightened. These guys, they couldn't chain them up. They made them live in the tombs. They made them live in the cemetery because they were so scared of these guys beforehand. But now when they are free, now they're really frightened. The people who had seen it told them what happened to the demon-possessed man and the pigs. Verse 17. So they began to beg Jesus to leave their country. Can you believe it? You see this wonderful miracle. These men that were tormented, these men that were evil, these men that you ran from, that you avoided, they are free in moments, completely sane. And you ask the healer to leave? I kind of wonder what they had in their minds. Okay, if he got rid of all those pigs in a couple of moments, what happens if he shows up in town? Now, fortunately for them, they didn't have the temple, so he wasn't going to come through with a scourge. But maybe they thought he was. Now, what's interesting is he's going to come back to the same area in a couple chapters. And we're going to see a totally different response. But we'll talk about that in a minute. The healing was uncomfortable to them. It was even painful. And so they asked Jesus to leave. Often, as I'm preaching, I can see it on people's faces. People that want God's healing so badly. But when he starts to do work in their hearts, they find it uncomfortable and sometimes even painful. And they set it down and they tell him to move on. And you know what? Jesus is a gentleman and he's not going to force his hand on you. And if you ask him to go, unfortunately, he will oblige you. And that's exactly what took place here. Verse 18. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed kept begging him to let him go with him. But Jesus wouldn't let him. Instead, he told him, go home to your family and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how merciful he's been to you. So the man left and began proclaiming in the Decapolis, that's the 10 cities around that area, how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone was utterly amazed. I feel that passage right there. This man's so dramatically changed. And he's like, oh, Jesus, just let me go with you. He's got thousands of followers. What's one more? But you see, the reason Jesus didn't want him to go was because he had a better plan for him. Jesus is going all over the countryside talking about transformation, talking about how the kingdom of God is different. This man didn't need that preaching because this man had experienced it. This man knew what change was. He had been freed. But what I find amazing, and maybe that's the reason this is personal to me, is he didn't just say, no, I don't want you to follow me. He said, no, I want you to go home and be a witness. This guy, he'd just been possessed by a demon. I don't know how much closer you can be to evil than this guy was. And Jesus, in a matter of 5 minutes, says, no, buddy, you're not going with me. You're going to go home and you're going to tell your family what God's done for you. He didn't have any seminary degree. He didn't know his Bible. He was a Gentile. He knew nothing except I was bound and Jesus freed me. He wasn't an orator. Jesus didn't give him what to say or how to say it. He simply just said, go home. Tell him what God's done for you and how he's been merciful to you. No facts, no figures, just your story. That's what he could tell, because that's what he'd experienced. After Jesus frees these two men and they're asked to leave, he was unable to teach anyone. And on the surface, you'd think that this was a win for Satan. You know, Jesus is over in Capernaum and Bethsaida, and I mean, he's having crowds that maul him every time he comes into a city. So now he's got to be sitting on a boat in the ocean, in the water, preaching to the crowd on the side of the seashore, just so he's not crushed. He's healing everybody he sees. Great things are happening, and God tells him to go. God the Father tells him to go across the lake. He comes up. He heals 2 people of demons, and that's all he's allowed to do. You'd think, wow, what a waste of time. But you see, God the Father had a bigger plan. There's an interesting contrast here. Back in chapter 1, Jesus, in his first miracle, he healed a demon-possessed man, and he told the man, now don't go and tell everybody. Keep it quiet. Well, the man didn't, and what happened? His one testimony, this Jewish man's one testimony was so bold that Jesus couldn't even enter cities after that. Here, Jesus heals a demon Gentile man, and instead of telling him not to tell his story, Jesus tells him, go and tell your story. Tell it to everybody. And in Mark chapter 7, verse 13 or 31, when Jesus returns to the same area in 2 chapters, he has a fantastic ministry. And the entire area was pleased that Jesus came. They rejected him the first time, but after they saw what Jesus had done for this demon-possessed Gentile, they wanted it too. God the Father had bigger plans. Verse 21. When Jesus again had crossed to the other side in a boat, a large crowd gathered around him by the seashore. Then a synagogue, Capernaum, by the way, it's that synagogue we've been talking about this entire time. When the synagogue leader named Jairus came, when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and he begged him urgently, saying, my little daughter is dying. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may get well and live. So Jesus went with him. A huge crowd kept following and jostling him. Now there was a woman, verse 25. Now there was a woman who had been suffering with a chronic bleeding for 12 years. Although she had endured a great deal under the care of many doctors and spent all of her money, she had not been helped at all, but rather grew worse. Since she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and she touched his robe. Because she'd been saying, if I could just touch his robe, I will get well. Her bleeding stopped at once and she felt her body that she was healed from her illness. Immediately, Jesus became aware that the power had gone out of him. So he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? So you get the picture. They come across the water. And Jairus, a powerful, rich man, the leader of the synagogue of that town, of his hometown, where Jesus has done a lot of ministry and a lot of Sabbath day healings, comes up, and as soon as Jesus gets to the shore, bows down and says, please, I've been waiting for you to get back. My daughter's dying. Would you come? So Jesus leaves the harbor and he's walking through town. The problem is he can't walk through a town without getting mobbed. And so he's struggling to get to Jairus' house to heal Jairus' daughter. And in the middle of this massive crowd, there's this lady, this Gentile lady, who's got an issue of blood. Now we know she's Gentile because if she was Jewish and had this issue of blood, Leviticus tells us she couldn't be around anybody. She was not allowed in public. The Greek word for this, although the chronic bleeding that you see in verse 25 up in the top corner, the word is mastix. And it literally gives the connotation of a whip or a scourge. So whatever she was facing was dreadfully painful, and she dealt with it for 12 years. And all it took was her touching Jesus' robe one moment, and she was healed. Jesus didn't say anything. He didn't do anything. He was doing his best to walk through the crowd. And all of a sudden, the power of the Spirit left him for this lady's healing, and he knew she was healed. Verse 31. I love the humor in this. His disciples asked him, "You see the crowd jostling you, right? And yet you're asking who touched you? Jesus, get real. We can't even walk straight." But he kept looking around to look at the woman who had done this. So the woman, verse 33, knowing what had happened to her, came forward fearfully, fell down trembling in front of him, and told him the whole truth. What a beautiful picture. But think about this lady. She's a Gentile in a Jewish town, surrounded by a bunch of Jews and a Jewish prophet. And she has the idea, if I can simply touch him, and nobody knows that I'm in the crowd, nobody knows I'm here. If I get healing, I can pass, I can leave, and nobody knows the difference. I can just squeeze a little bit of healing out of that prophet and go. Why'd Jesus call her out? He didn't have to. He could have felt that power go out. He probably knew it was her. And he could have kept going. But he didn't. He called her out. He could have went on and no one else would have known the difference. I think the reason was, partially, was because she was fearful. Like she'd done something wrong. And Jesus wanted her to know that I don't care that you're a Gentile. You're a daughter to me. And I'll heal you just like I heal anybody else. Could be it. I think maybe Jesus didn't want her, if she was going to have doubts later, that pain might come back, that issue of blood might come back. I think maybe he wanted to talk to her personally so that she knew she was healed and she was healed good forever. Could have been it. Maybe Jesus just wanted to speak to her personally, to see her faith, to see if she really believed. Maybe. Maybe it was because he wanted her to be at peace and be healed permanently. He says to her, be at peace, be healed. Verse 34. But I think there's one more reason, and it wasn't for her. I think the reason Jesus called her out, and I think it's the more important reason, is because of him. Verse 34, Jesus looks at her and he says, "Daughter," by the way, this is the only place, I'm getting ahead of myself, I'll get to that in a minute. "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed from your illness." Verse 35, while he was still speaking, he's giving this lady comfort. While he's still speaking, some people came from the synagogue leader's home and said, "Your daughter's dead. Why bother the teacher anymore? It's too late, buddy." Now, I don't think any of us could really imagine where poor Jairus is at right here. His daughter's dying. He's risked a lot. He's put his reputation on the line just to come to this Jesus. He's seen Jesus heal others, and he's in desperate need. So he goes and he's waiting at the docks for Jesus to return. Jesus comes back. Jesus says he's going to go with him. And now it's bumper-to-bumper traffic all the way home. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm running behind, it seems like I find every joker in the world is driving below the speed limit, and they don't want to let me around. And, oh, come on, would you just get out of the way for just a minute? Let me pass you just a moment. And then what do? On the straightaways, when it's the easiest place for you to pass, they always speed up, right? Well, this is what Jairus is going through, except in his case, it's a life and death matter because his daughter is dying before his family's eyes. And he's begging Jesus, "Jesus, come on, please, let's go. Please. She's just had an issue of blood. You've healed her. All right, let's keep going. Do you really need to talk to her, Jesus? Come on. I'm on a waiting list here. You called me. You said you'd do this for me first. My daughter's going to die." He needed Jesus to move, but Jesus was taking his time. Sounds like Lazarus being raised too, doesn't it? And then he decides to talk to her. I'm sure Jairus is thinking, "You don't need to talk to this lady. You're giving her peace. That's okay, but I'm in trouble." And then while Jesus is talking to her, the worst news he could have had, what he feared the most, came true. Buddy, you're too late. Don't worry about bothering the master now. You failed. Your daughter's dead because you couldn't get back in time. I think the reason Jesus talked to this lady was so that Jairus, in a few moments, would know that Jesus had the power to heal. And there was going to be a testimony of it. Verse 36. But when Jesus heard what they said, he told Jairus, "Stop being afraid. Just keep believing." So Jesus allowed no one further to go no further with him except for Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a mass confusion. People were crying and sobbing loudly. He entered the house and he asked them, "Why all this confusion and crying? The child isn't dead, she's sleeping." They laughed and laughed at him. The New King James says they laughed him to scorn. Now, these were paid mourners. That's what you did back then. If you had somebody sick or die, you pay these people to cry for you. And apparently they weren't very good at their jobs because they're over here laughing Jesus to scorn. But when he had driven them all outside, he kicked them out of the house. That's funny. He took the child's father, mother, along with the men who were with him, Peter, James, and John, and they went into the room where the child was. And he took her by the hand, and he told her, Talitha Kumi, which means young lady or little sheep. I tell you, get up. This is actually Aramaic. And remember, I told you before, Mark is writing to Gentiles. And so he translates the Aramaic for them so they'd know what the phrase was. The young lady got up at once, and she started to walk. She was 12 years old. Instantly, they were overcome with astonishment. But Jesus strictly ordered them not to tell anyone about this. He also told them to give her something to eat. I think that's just funny. First of all, Jesus was concerned, hey, she's hungry. Give her something to eat. But second of all, imagine what's going to happen when that little girl walks out of the room. Or further, when she walks out of the building with all those paid mourners out there. I guarantee you, everybody's mouth was on the ground. Don't tell anybody, though. Don't tell anybody. Oh, man. Jesus has the power to bring the dead to life, whether spiritually or physically. Remember, when we see Jesus doing something physical here in Mark, he's also, and Jesus made mention of it, we talked about it 2 weeks ago, he's making mention that what he does physically, he also does in a spiritual sense as well. And Jesus has the power to bring the very dead to life. Luke chapter 7, he also brought the widow's son, the widow of Nain's son to life. John chapter 11, he brings Lazarus to life. It's really interesting. There's no one ever recorded where anyone ever died in Jesus' presence. Not even the thieves on the cross. They're all going to die together, and Jesus dies before they do. That's interesting. Not saying that there wasn't anybody that died, but they just never recorded it. Now, that is where we're going to end, but I want to cover just a couple things really quickly. I've said names, dates, places, numbers, they're all intentional, they're all important. And there's something that we may have missed reading through the story. I know I did on the first occasion. How long did the woman have the issue of blood? She had it for 12 years. Jesus called her daughter. Now, what's interesting about that, Jesus never called anyone else daughter in all of his ministry. She's the only one. And he mentioned it to a Gentile. We know she was Gentile from Leviticus chapter 15, verse 19. If she had an issue of blood, she was not allowed to be in public. But then you go to the story of Jairus' daughter. And both of these stories, they're intermingled because they're happening at the same time. Mark mentions that she was 12 years old. Both were daughters, verse 25 and verse 42. Now, if you go to the scriptures, we find the number 7 all over the place, right? You also find the number 12. There's 12 tribes. There's 12 apostles ruling the 12 tribes. There's 12 kingdom of heaven parables, Matthew 13, 18, 20, 22, and 25. There's 12 kingdom mysteries that you find in the New Testament. There's 12,000 that are sealed from each of the 12 tribes in Revelation chapter 7, 144, right? 144,000. The New Jerusalem, when you go to Revelation, it has 12 gates, 12 foundation stones, and its size is 12,000 by 12,000 by 12,000. You see, and this is just a brief, meager pickering of them, but 12 is found a lot. So what's the big deal? Why the 12? Why even mention it? What's the big deal? Well, I think it leads to textual consistency is the best way I know how to describe it. It leads to what you see happening in real life, happening in the scripture. You see, she was a Gentile who interrupted Jesus on the way to go heal the Jew. Think about it. The Jew, Israel, is called the daughter of Jerusalem. On many occasions you can find it in the scripture. And Jesus is on his way to heal them. And then in the middle of it, all of a sudden there's this approach by this Gentile. And he turns around and he heals her and calls her daughter. And then goes and heals Jerusalem. Contextually, that's pretty specific. But it also matches what happens and what we find will happen in the book of Revelation. She was a Gentile. She had no specific place. She had no right to come to Jesus and ask for healing. She was not a believer. She believed enough that he could heal, but that's all she had. Yet she knew that Jesus had the power to heal because she had seen it happen. What she may not have known was when she was reaching out, she took a hold of Jesus' authority. Every time I come to this passage, I always want to mention it. Mark doesn't mention it, but Matthew does. It talks about the hem, that she grabbed a hold of the hem of his garment. The Hebrew word is shul, and in ancient Mesopotamia, the bottom edge of your garment was your hem. And it was your rank. It was your family line. If a husband wanted to divorce his wife, he could cut off her hem from her robe, and that was considered a divorce. How we would think of it is if you were in the military, it's your stripes or stars or clover leaves, whatever it is. It was your badge of honor on the bottom hem of your robe. As a matter of fact, when you go to the Christmas story, it mentions that Jesus was wrapped in swaddling clothes. Those are actually, that was the hem of his garment. When a woman found out she was pregnant, she would stitch the family line in that hem. And then he would later sew it onto his clothes, but that told you what line he was from, his importance, because that was very important. That was your inheritance. That was if you were going to be a priest or not. I mean, it was a big deal. So this, it held your authority. And if you ripped that off, you ripped off your authority. You remember, there's other places you can see it here, but, well, sorry. There we go. You remember David, and Saul's in the cave relieving himself. David comes off and he cuts off the hem. Well, that was prophetic because Saul was ripped from the kingdom. And David later felt bad about that, and he apologized because he realized what he had done in that prophecy. And so he apologized to Saul, but Saul also knew what it meant, that he had ripped off Saul's authority. And then Ruth, same thing. Ruth asked Boaz to spread his shawl over her, and that wasn't a, I don't know how to say that right and keep it PG, but you understand what I'm saying. She wasn't asking as a proposition. She was asking for a marriage, that he would put his protection, his authority, his kinsmanship over her, that the lands would be given back. All of that took place from the hem, and that's where this lady grabbed. Also, another thing that they would do is they would take the tassels that were on the hem and they would hold them up, and as they prayed, they would rub those tassels because it was the authority. And that's what she touched. Yet she was a Gentile. She probably didn't know that. And she really had no right to do that either. We found in our passage tonight that Jesus has power over nature, that he has power over Satan and Satan's chains on people, that he has power over disease, with the woman of blood, and he also has power over death. Every time we see Jesus do something spiritual physical in the book of Mark, he's doing something spiritual. Jesus has the power to raise the dead to life. The disease that has wrecked your body for years, spiritually, he also has the ability to heal. The protection that you need in the spiritual realm, he gives you. Her thoughts. We would love to have the thought that, well, Jesus could answer everybody else's prayer, but not mine. Not me. Not my situation. Not my struggle. But this lady, even though she had no right to, she thought, well, maybe, just maybe, it would be my situation. Maybe he would heal me. If I got out there and touched him, and I know he has healing, if I could go out there and touch him, maybe he would take care of my situation. There was all kinds of people around Jesus, and they were pushing him, shoving him. They were literally mobbing him, and they weren't getting healing because they were saying, not me. Not me. But this one Gentile slithers through the crowd and says, maybe me. Maybe Jesus can answer my need today. Maybe Jesus can heal me. Maybe Jesus can heal my daughter who's dying. So what about you? Are you like the others in the crowd? Close to Jesus, pressing against him, but not receiving any of his power? Or are you like this Gentile that says, maybe he can give me the protection I need. Maybe he can destroy the chains that bind me. Maybe he can heal the disease that I have. And maybe he can even cure me from death to life. Just maybe. And if there is an answer of yes in that maybe, isn't it worth slithering through the crowd to Jesus to find out? There's a whole lot of folks that don't. There's a whole lot of folks that sit inside the church that don't. But if you want it bad enough, and you think there might be a chance, it's definitely worth the effort to find out. I tried to think off the top of my head, and I didn't do a deep search, and you can think about this with me. I could think of only one person specifically that ever asked for healing that never got it in the Bible, and that was Paul. Paul prayed over and over again for the healing of the thorn of his flesh, and he didn't receive it. But you know what? He prayed until God gave him an answer. Because even Paul said, just maybe. There's a whole lot of people that when they asked, they received. Hi everyone. Thank you so much for watching. I pray this video was a blessing to you. If it was, please hit the like button. This helps other people find our content as well. You can also subscribe to the channel by clicking on my beautiful face. This will give you announcements when we put out new videos. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists of our verse-by-verse Bible studies, and then you'll also see the newest video that we've put out. We try to put out 2 or 3 a week. I pray that God richly blesses you. Thank you for watching.